Very good. So, on that note, folks, I figured I would just read from the beginning of the Kamala Harris book. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. It's a short book. It's only 133 pages long. It's an essay in 3 parts that I wrote about Kamala Harris. And I talked about a lot more than Kamala Harris. And actually, I kind of get into that in the introduction. So I'm just going to start reading. Kamala Harris and the Future of America. This is not a biography of Kamala Harris, the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party in the 2020 election. This is an essay about U.S. society and global politics. This is an examination of Harris's record and life story and an explanation of the political, cultural, and psychological trends that created such a figure. This text is highly critical of Kamala Harris, highlighting her negative attributes and digging into her life story. However, this text is not intended to make the case that she and Joe Biden are somehow worse than Donald Trump, or to compel the reader to vote or campaign in a certain way. The book has no loyalty to any campaign, political figure, or organization within U.S. society at this time, and is not intended to compel specific action from those who read it. This book draws heavily from Marxism and leftist thought to examine one individual who is likely to become highly influential in the coming years, regardless of the November election results. The text is divided into 3 chapters. 1. Where did Kamala Harris come from? 2. Psychology behind politics. 3. The geopolitical stage. This book is written out of a deep love for the working people of the United States and all who have suffered from oppression. The reader is expected to come away with a deeper understanding of the current crisis in U.S. society, its roots, and the hope for potential resolutions. It is written in the hopes of inspiring all of those who would dare join arm in arm with the rest of the human race in a struggle for a better world. Section 1. Where did Kamala Harris come from? The decision came late. August 1st had been the date when vice presidential nominee Joe Biden was to be, hold up, I'm trying to read the chats, and all right. The decision came late. August 1st had been the date when the vice presidential nominee of Joe Biden was to be announced, but the decision was not made until August 11th. Amid the confusion and anticipation, something was happening behind closed doors. The U.S. public got to know Kamala Harris through the months of delayed decision, as she appeared on almost every mainstream talk show, giggling, talking about her childhood, reflecting on her experiences with racism, and her hobbies such as cooking. Politico had hinted that Kamala Harris would be the nominee in what appeared to be a leak, but the Biden campaign made it clear that the decision had not yet been made. Kamala had seemed to be the obvious choice when Joe Biden announced his pick would be a woman of color. But yet, new names suddenly appeared in the running, as if some desperate resistance to picking her was coming from various quarters within the Biden camp. In the week prior to the delayed announcement, the media had suddenly begun highlighting former UN Ambassador Susan Rice as an alternative to Harris. Suddenly, the relatively unknown Los Angeles Congresswoman Karen Bass was filling the headlines as well. Almost as soon as Karen Bass's name hit the national media, she was subjected to an all-out red-baiting campaign by the press. Mainstream newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times were pointing out that this vice presidential nominee had visited Cuba. This potential vice presidential nominee had visited Cuba with the Venceremos brigades during the 1970s and praised Fidel Castro. Much like months before with Bernie Sanders, these oddly worded press articles framed Bass as cozy with Washington's geopolitical opponents and thus unfit for office. Information about Bass's travels and associations decades before that likely appeared in some kind of intelligence background check or dossier were suddenly found in the press. Bass was desperately reassuring the public that she was not a communist, and it became clear that Biden was unlikely to select her. The schedule for the Democratic National Convention speakers, released just hours before the announcement of the VP pick, listed Kamala Harris as speaking in a separate time slot from the vice presidential pick. This was almost declaring she would not be selected. Harris was reported to have unfollowed Joe Biden on Twitter just a few hours before the announcement was made as well. When the news finally came that Kamala Harris had been selected, many were quite perplexed. She seemed like the obvious pick months ago. Why the delays? Why the last-minute scrambling? Why the incorrect Democratic National Convention schedule? Why had Karen Bass been raised from obscurity only to be roundly condemned as a communist sympathizer? It is clear some negotiations had taken place. Last-minute deals were made. Joe Biden's arm was twisted. A rival from the Democratic primary race, who had blasted him as being supportive of school segregation, was now his running mate. Kamala Harris had even said on the campaign trail that she believed the allegations that Joe Biden was a sexual predator. Yet, all of this was water under the bridge. Kamala Harris was Joe Biden's running mate, the Democratic Party's nominee for vice president. How chaotic will this upcoming election get? Writing it down. So what was going on behind the scenes? Who was pushing for Kamala Harris? Who was desperately opposing her? Where does Kamala Harris come from? And what does it teach us about American politics in our time? These are the questions that will be answered in this short booklet. Kamala Harris did rather poorly in the Democratic primary. Her personality and record doesn't really appeal to U.S. voters, especially in the swing states Biden needs to win. The most damning moment for Kamala's 2020 presidential campaign came on July 31st, 2019. Rival candidate Tulsi Gabbard used her limited time during the debate to highlight Kamala's record as a criminal prosecutor. Hawaii Congresswoman Gabbard crammed a lot into just a few sentences. Quote, Kamala Harris says she's proud of her record. I'm concerned about this record of Senator Harris. She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California, and she fought to keep a cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way. Kamala had no rebuttal to these obviously true facts about her career as a prosecutor and attorney general in California. In fact, Gabbard's statements were just the tip of the iceberg. Kamala Harris had imprisoned parents due to their children being truant from school and laughed about it during a presentation. Kamala Harris also mocked protesters against the prison industrial complex, speaking in a sarcastic voice, strutting around the stage of a Chicago Ideas Forum saying, build more schools, less jails. Build more schools, less jails. Put money into prison, education, not prisons. There's a fundamental problem with that approach, in my opinion. You still haven't addressed why I have 3 padlocks on my front door. There should be a broad consensus that there should be serious, severe, and swift consequences to crime.
Signs, build more schools, less jails. Build more schools, less jails. And we walk around everywhere. Build more schools. We protest. Build more schools, less jails. Put money into education, not prisons. There's a fundamental problem.
The idea of serious and severe and swift consequences is something that seems to arouse Kamala Harris. She was desperate to have Kevin Cooper executed and battled in court, hoping to prevent the DNA evidence California Governor Gavin Newsom requested. The evidence was acquired against Kamala's wishes, and Kevin Cooper's execution was halted. She now says she feels awful about this and blames lower-level attorneys for the decision. Kevin Cooper remains in prison, though he has left death row. Kamala's office, as California Attorney General, worked to prevent nonviolent offenders from being released from California prisons after the state Supreme Court ruled that prisons were unconstitutionally overcrowded. The reason to keep people locked up was, quote, if forced to release these inmates early, prisons would lose an important labor pool. Harris secured the conviction of over 1,900 people for marijuana, a few hundred more than Tulsi's number, and did indeed laugh about it when asked if she ever recreationally utilized cannabis herself. Almost 2,000 people received criminal records and often jail time for doing something Kamala apparently did herself. As she laughed about it on the Breakfast Club radio program, the video of the interview reveals a face that is clearly oblivious to the hypocrisy to which she is confessing. The lives she destroyed are a mere bureaucratic detail, forgotten and tucked away as she strives for more personal glory and fame. When asked about what music she had listened to as she smoked pot as a college student, she said it had to be Snoop, referring to the rapper Snoop Dogg. Many bloggers noted that the time in which Kamala Harris was a college student and the musical career of Snoop Dogg do not align. Kamala's post-secondary education took place long before Snoop Dogg's rap albums hit the shelves. She was most likely lying. Many voices have also criticized the Jamaican Indian American woman's various attempts to pander to residents of urban black communities who she took delight in imprisoning as San Francisco Attorney General. Writing for Reason.com, CJ Ciaramella writes, whenever Harris is pressed about specific instances where she was decidedly unprogressive, she dodges, misleads, or glosses over facts. His research points out that as prosecutor, Kamala Harris defended the death penalty, always running on a platform of keeping it in practice in California. She opposed increasing oversight of police officers and investigating fatal shootings. Her office fought against exonerating the wrongfully convicted and protected the Orange County District Attorney's Office after it was caught operating an unconstitutional jailhouse snitching program. Judges repeatedly called out Kamala Harris and her office for withholding evidence, not notifying defense attorneys of misconduct by drug lab technicians, and having a level of indifference when it came to unethical and illegal practices that could help secure criminal convictions. The behavior of Kamala Harris as San Francisco District Attorney and as the California Attorney General is morally horrendous. The efforts to destroy the lives of innocent people and to manipulate the California legal system in order to do it should disturb anyone who believes in justice or who possesses empathy, most especially someone with a leftist or anti-oppression worldview. How many nonviolent citizens ended up behind bars or with criminal records simply for the victimless crime of smoking pot? How many innocent people were convicted due to her practice of withholding evidence to hurt the defense? What kind of person would actively oppose utilizing DNA evidence to exonerate people on death row? Did the potential for taking an innocent person's life not concern her? Clearly not. Harris's behavior might make sense if she was part of the thin blue line milieu. Police officers, their family members, the various police unions, the Fraternal Order of Police, and others. And then nationalization, setting price control. Should we focus on closing the wealth gap? Nepal is already on there, but I'll talk about, closing wealth gap. All right. Cool. All right. All righty. Harris' behavior might make sense if she was part of the thin blue line milieu. Police officers, their family members, the various police unions, and the Fraternal Order of Police often cultivate a strange victim mentality and reinterpretation of events. Adherents of this right-wing layer of U.S. society believe police brutality is a liberal hoax, and that the annually occurring deaths of officers on the job are the fault of anti-racist activists. In the minds of those who operate within this alternative reality of the thin blue line, the U.S. suffers from an overextension of civil liberties to protect criminals. They see the police as under siege from the radical left and an overly compassionate society that coddles criminals. This refers not only to law enforcement and officials themselves, but various right-wing vigilantes and fanatics like infamous George Zimmerman, who buy into this worldview. This viewpoint is simply contrary to reality. The United States has more prisoners than any other country in the world, not just in numbers, but in percentage. Juries across the country rarely acquit, and very few defendants even bother to risk going to trial. However, the illusions of this thin blue line narrative are often utilized by prosecutors and police officers to justify their own misconduct. Kamala Harris, the kind of misconduct Kamala Harris specialized in. Prosecutors and police officers who feel that racism is a liberal anti-cop myth often feel that they must lie, brutalize people, withhold evidence, and fight dirty in defense of law and order. Various TV programs and films feature a heroic, dirty cop who breaks the law and flouts legal procedure in order to put away a, quote, bad guy. However, Kamala Harris is not the daughter of police officers. She does not come from the thin blue line milieu. As shocking as it may sound, her parents were both left-wing activists. And Harris' autobiography, The Truths We Hold, published in 2019, she wrote, quote, America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice. I know this history well, of innocent men framed, of charges brought against people of color without sufficient evidence, of prosecutors hiding information that would exonerate defendants, of the disproportionate application of the law. The opening chapters of The Truth We Hold describes how her parents met each other attending civil rights and anti-Vietnam War protests in Berkeley, California. She writes, my parents often brought me in a stroller with them to civil rights marches. I have young memories of a sea of legs moving about, of energy and shouts and chants. Social justice was a central part of family discussions. Describing her parents, she wrote, they went to peaceful protests that were attacked by the police with fire hoses. They marched against the Vietnam War and for voting rights and civil rights. She described being a toddler and attending a daycare that was, quote, small but welcoming, with posters of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman on the wall. Indeed, Berkeley, California in the 1960s was the epicenter of a cultural movement that swept the United States and Western Europe in what was called the New Left. Both of her parents attended the University of California, Berkeley. In the year of Kamala's birth, students at the University of California, Berkeley launched the free speech movement. The university administration had forbidden students from organizing around off-campus issues. The students demanded the right to engage in political activism on campus and engaged in a campaign of civil disobedience, eventually forcing the university to back down. On October 1st, 1964, a student named Jack Weinberg set up a literature table promoting civil rights. He was arrested, but thousands of students surrounded the police car, blocking it from taking him in for booking. Students held the police car for 32 hours, setting up a microphone on top of it and using it as a miniature stage. Later in December of that year, student leader Mario Savio thundered his famous words to a gathering of student activists. "There comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. You've got to put your bodies upon the gears, upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. You've got to indicate to the people who run it, the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." And I even included some graphics there. There's students standing on top of the police car, Mario Savio on top of the police car while they were holding it for 32 hours. Here's the free speech protests in front of the Berkeley campus there.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
The Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Progressive Labor Party, and various Marxist-Leninist groups were certainly involved in the free speech movement and the various left-wing protests in Berkeley during this era. The Black Panther Party raised money for shotguns by selling Mao Zedong's Little Red Book on the campus. Many of the most prominent leaders of the various remaining Marxist-Leninist sects in the United States began their activism in Berkeley. Bob Avakian, who now leads the Revolutionary Communist Party, was a Berkeley native and son of a local judge, Spurgeon Avakian. He was heavily involved in the free speech movement and later the founding of the California Peace and Freedom Party. The Trotskyite International Socialist Organization was the largest Marxist cadre organization in the USA during the 1980s and 90s. The organization traces its roots back to the Berkeley Independent Socialist Club, Shachtmanite Trotskyists who joined the free speech protests. Jerry Rubin, leader of the Yippies, who was a household name during the late 1960s, began his activism as an organizer at the Berkeley Vietnam Day Committee. Events in Berkeley during the 1960s significantly impacted the entire country. Ronald Reagan's reputation among conservatives on the national stage greatly expanded as he pounded the podium against the, quote, mess at Berkeley and cracked down on leftist student activists as California's governor. The Bay Area radical magazine, Ramparts, became an essential source of news and analysis for left-wing activists all throughout the country. Ramparts introduced the country to the writings of imprisoned black radical Eldridge Cleaver, whose book Soul on Ice was widely studied. Cleaver eventually became a leader of the Black Panther Party after being released from prison. The editor of Ramparts was David Horowitz, a young radical whose parents had been heavily involved in the Communist Party USA. Horowitz eventually became a neoconservative during the 1980s and repudiated his years of left-wing journalism and activism. As radical politics flourished in Berkeley during the 1960s, something else was happening beneath the surface. At the time, it was only speculated about. Rumors of government drug distributions and covert CIA funding of Trotskyites persisted, especially among hardline communists, but nobody really knew this was going on for sure. But now, due to leaks and congressional investigations and documents released by the Freedom of Information Act, we know that one of the most successful intelligence operations ever conducted by the CIA was in full swing. With the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, the CIA was covertly funding left-wing artists, writers, and activists in the hopes of redirecting them to oppose the Soviet Union and China. The New Left was synthetically created as a makeshift intellectual barrier between the circles of free thinkers, intellectuals, and dissidents in Western countries and the Soviet Union. The CIA's website currently brags about the program. New York City Trotskyite professor Sidney Hook, the lone socialist voice advocating a total ban on the Communist Party USA, wrote enthusiastically about the program, asking for funding. Quote, "Give me $100 million and 1,000 dedicated people, and I will guarantee to generate such a wave of democratic unrest among the masses, yes, even among Stalin's own soldiers, that all of his problems for a long time to come will be internal. I can find the people." That's Sidney Hook.
Signs, build more schools, less jails. Build more schools, less jails. And we walk around everywhere. Build more schools. We protest. Build more schools, less jails. Put money into education, not prisons. There's a fundamental problem